reading a story during the week that I found on Facebook. Sometimes good things come from Facebook. Also, this story comes out of the United States. Sometimes good things come out of the United States. The last couple of times we've talked about the United States, it hasn't been pleasant things, but this was something exceptional. I wanted to share it with you this morning. A guy called Julio Diaz was coming home one night, as he always does, part of his daily routine. He's a 31-year-old social worker and ends an hour-long subway commute to the Bronx, one stop early, so that he can eat at his favourite diner. But this particular night he was coming home, Diaz stepped off the number 6 train and onto an empty platform, only to find out that he was faced with a young boy who had a knife. The boy demanded his wallet, and Diaz pulled it straight out and gave it to him, and the boy walked away. As he walked away, Diaz said to him, "Hey, wait a minute, you forgot something. If you're going to be robbing people for the rest of the night, you might as well take my coat. It's cold tonight, and you need to keep warm." The young robber, looked at his would-be victim as if he was saying, "What on earth are you on about?" And Diaz said that he asked me, "Why are you doing this? Why are you giving me your coat?" So Diaz replied, "If you're willing to risk your freedom for a few dollars, then I guess you must really need the money. I mean, all I wanted to do tonight was go to my diner and eat a meal, but now you've got my wallet, that's going to be difficult. Of course, we could both go together." After a couple of extra exchanges, the two of them head off to his diner. They then sit down. Everybody seems to know him in the diner. Diaz, he talks to all of them quite happily, and the boy's stunned by this. He says, "Do you work here, or do you own this place?" "No," he said, "I just come here every night after work." He said, "I had no idea that people were such friends, or could be such friends, when they otherwise don't know each other." So Diaz says to him, "Well, what are we having?" And so they sat down and had a meal together. When the meal had finished, Diaz says, "Well, it's a little bit awkward." He says, "But you've got the only money, because you've got my wallet. So unless we want to be washing dishes, I'd really like it if you give me my wallet back." So he gave him his wallet back. Diaz then took out the money for the meal, and then took out the rest of the money and gave it to the boy. And then started a friendship between the boy and Diaz that went on and enabled the boy to begin to turn his life around. I think that's a cute story. And why I think it's a helpful story for us this morning is it does demonstrate what is possible if we absorb some of the evil that people intend on us and begin to turn it around, begin to make it into something more worthwhile. And what I see a lot of in public life, which I think is a great shame, is that when we see that somebody's done something wrong, or they've had a go at somebody, instead of trying to turn it into something that is constructive, we get a kind of feud begins, and then a feud becomes a war, and all we see, it's like watching sort of kids in a playground hitting each other. At some point, if we can absorb some of this and begin to make it into something special, then we transform the situation. And on this Feast of Transfiguration, this is something I'd like to explore just for a few moments. And I'd like to do it in an unlikely place. I'd like to look at the Psalm for this morning. So if you've got the Psalm in front of you, that would be helpful. I don't preach on the Psalms that often, but I love to preach on them, because they're all about the extraordinary frailty of humanity and the way in which God comes to us and overshadows that humanity and transforms it. Let's look at Psalm 99 briefly that we read this morning. Psalm 99 is actually a royal psalm. There are 5 designations for psalms, and one of those designations is royal psalms. They're used at enthronements of kings. And you can imagine this being used in A Wonderful Enthronement of a King, because it talks about our God as King. And it begins in a kind of the most expected way. The Lord is King, let the peoples tremble. He sits enthroned upon the cherub, and let the earth quake. So we have this idea of a very powerful God. And that all makes sense to us. Nothing irregular about that. But as the psalm goes on, the psalm begins to twist around concepts which normally for ancient peoples would be difficult. Let me read a bit further. The Lord is King in Zion. He is exalted over all his peoples. We now have a specific way in which our God relates to the world through Zion and the peoples. Normally, when people talked in the ancient world about God figures, they would see them as qualitatively different, completely separate from the rest of us. The divine figures, whatever they might be, whether it was a pantheon of divines or a single divine, would be seen as so separate from us that they would have no interest in us. I wonder if you remember back in the old sort of, not a sitcom, but an old sort of kids drama, Hercules. And it always used to start with back in the days when the gods were petty and cruel, and there was just one man, Hercules, and he was the man that righted wrongs and so forth. The gods were seen as this kind of separate entity, and they would play with us and toy with us for their amusement. That was kind of the pagan idea of the way the gods worked. And you can understand how it generated. It generated because people's lives were so random, and this made people uneasy. Some people died, some people lived, some people got sick, and some didn't. So people began to think, why does this happen? And they thought, maybe it's the gods. They play with us. They toy with us. Like they don't care. They're just having a bit of fun. That is the image of the way in which the God or the gods worked. Now we go back to Psalm 99. The Lord, our God, is exalted over the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name, for holy is the Lord. Right? That's the completion of the image. But listen to verse 4. Mighty King, lover of justice, you have established equity. Verse 4, you have established equity. Equity, in other words, fairness, justice. Why is God interested in these things? Why is God interested in equity between people? That people get fairness, that justice is done, so that those who are vulnerable are looked after. Why would God be interested in that? But for Israel's God, God is interested in that. God is not petty or cruel. God does not toy with us, play with us, give us a hard time, use us for his amusement. God is actually a lover of justice and somebody who gets not only who establishes equity, who connects with us, but cares for us. Now that's a different image of God from the one the pagans worked with, which was kind of, they toy with you. But it goes on. Oh, exalt the Lord your God and bow down before his footstool, for he is holy. And here's this refrain we're going to get from verse 3 and verse 5, and then in verse 9. For the Lord God is holy. Holiness implies this otherworldness. Right? When we talk about holiness in the church, we talk about holy to be separated out, to be so pure and unadulterated that it cannot be touched by what is profane and everyday. So it gets separated out. So God is separated from us by definition, to keep God holy and pure. But here's the twist. God doesn't stay there. God doesn't stay remote from us. Maybe God would have been better off. I don't think so. I think there's something about the need for God to continue to reach out for us, to us, his creation. But the idea of holiness is not to stay separate, but to bring the separated qualities, the pure qualities, into the everyday. And so we get here. Moses and Aaron, we hear in verse 6. Moses and Aaron among his priests, Samuel among those who called on his name. Here are the leaders, the lawgivers, the speakers, the prophets, all of which are touched by God's presence and also that bring God into the everyday. They cry to the Lord, it says, and he answers them. Here's their prayer life at work. God doesn't stay remote and cannot stay remote. But does God ever speak to us? Does God ever really communicate with his people? Well, verse 7 tells us that very thing. He spoke to them in a pillar of cloud. And he gives them commandments. And they keep his decrees and statutes that he gave them. There is an intimate connection now between God and the people. This is the ancient people of Israel. O Lord our God, you answered them, it says. You were a forgiving God. Now we're going even further. Not only is God now communicating, listening and communicating with us, but now God is forgiving us. So all the messiness of our lives, all the problems that we have, God doesn't say, I'm not going to deal with that. I'm just going to deal with it when you're being good. Right? This is not Santa. Here is an opportunity for us to see that God connects with us even in our waywardness, even with our problems, even with the things that don't quite go right. I always used to say to people, sometimes people say to me, when I come to Eucharist on Sunday morning, sometimes I get to a point and I say, no, not today. I'm not in the right mood. I'm not in the right frame of mind. I've done too many things that I'm a bit ashamed of this week. I don't think I'll come to Eucharist. I used to say to people, never do that. Never do that. I'd rather you came to the altar rails of God for the Eucharist and cried your eyes out than stay in your seat and say, no, not today. Because this is the God who connects with us. He doesn't say, when you're ready, when I feel that you're up to the mark, you can come forward. Then I'll reach out to you. Then I'm happy to receive you. This is not the God we deal with. And even in a psalm, these are the ancient texts, long before Jesus was on the scene, in a worldly sense. Long before this, already this God was the God they believed in. This is why we can never say, isn't the God of the Old Testament different from the God of the New? Not true. All the hallmarks of the God of Jesus Christ is already here, long before Jesus came to earth in a bodily way. The continuing reaching out of God, forgiving, and also avenging their wrongdoing. Sounds a bit harsh, but God must deal with evil. And we looked at that when we looked through Revelation. Do you remember that? We talked about the wrath of the Lamb. And we said God must confront evil. That's important. So he must deal with whatever is wrong. But at the same time, don't forget that his attitude to us will always be one of grace, forgiveness, love and compassion. So this is the God we are. This is the God we are part of, and the God of our faith, and the God who has been with the ancient people of God and us for millennia. What then can we say about this as far as the Transfiguration is concerned? Well, when Jesus shows his moment, has his moment up the mountain, and he says, and he's speaking with Moses and Elijah, we see in Moses and Elijah the two great symbols of the ancient tradition, of the whole people of God going back into the time of the Psalms. Moses, the giver of the law, and Elijah, the pinnacle of the prophets. Here is the tradition that Jesus is now speaking with, and he is claiming that tradition. He's claiming the God of his ancestors, and he is now going to show to his disciples for the first time since his baptism that this is part of who he is. Sometimes I wonder whether they walk around with him thinking, Who is this guy? Is there anything special about him? And suddenly they go up the mountain and suddenly realise they're in the presence of something extraordinary. And I think there can be a temptation in us to be too casual about our connection with God. This psalm reminds us, as is the Transfiguration, that we should not be too casual about our relationship with God. God is something extraordinary in our lives, and more than we can imagine, and more than we can process a lot of the time. So we have that sense of awe and wonder about being in God's presence. But that holiness of God does not stay remote from us. It comes close. And this is a message to us, because Jesus comes down the mountain and continues his ministry among the people in flesh and blood. He does not stay. You and I enjoy time with God, where we celebrate and enjoy the holiness of God, and we let that kind of rub off on us on Sundays. That's a really good thing. But then we take that out into the world to connect with other people and to let that love and compassion flow over onto them. So I come back to my original story about Mr. Diaz, who in a moment of love and compassion reached out to someone who was doing the wrong thing, who was threatening his life, who was trying to rob him of his goods. And instead of being angry and upset, trying to accost the man or do something to make him pay, he reached out to him. Every moment of every day we have those opportunities where people are needy, and quite often when people are angry with us or they are violent, it's because they are needy. We have these opportunities every day to reach out to others and to bring the little bit of holiness we've experienced with God into a broken, divided, violent, difficult world. As Mr. Diaz did, I'd like to think we can as well. I encourage you to think about what it means to bring the holiness that we experience back into the world and do things that help transform and transfigure it as a token of the way in which we are loved by God every day. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.